Mark Edward Mason Jr., affectionately known as Markie, was born on November 24, 2010 in Newcastle, Pennsylvania. His parents were Maram Wajeb Sada and Mark Mason Sr. Long before Markie came into this world, his mother was born in Syria and moved to Newcastle in 1999. Upon arriving in the States, Maram faced many challenges. She didn't speak English, only Syrian, Arabic, and French. Now, as a youth, she enrolled in the Newcastle area school district. A French teacher would later help Maram translate and navigate her new environment. Over time, Maram eventually became fluent in English. She went on to earn her GED before enrolling at Beaver County Community College to pursue a certification in phlebotomy. After college, Maram found employment at ARC Human Services in Beaver County, where she assisted mentally challenged individuals while waitressing at an Olive Garden in another local restaurant part-time. It was during this period when Maram met Mark Mason Sr., who she eventually married and had 2 children with. Their firstborn was Markie, and a year later, his younger brother was born. Unfortunately, the marriage didn't end up working out. When the two inevitably divorced, Maram gained custody of the boys. Despite their separation, Maram and Mark Sr. remained amicable and split time equally as parents to ensure a stable environment for their 2 boys.
Growing up in Newcastle, the 2 households were filled with the playful sounds of a typical childhood. Laughter, the hum of video games, and the occasional squabble over toys appeared to be the only issues in the home early on. Markie and his brother were very close, and they considered each other to be their best friends. As he got older, some of Markie's favorite things were riding his bike through the neighborhood, playing tag with his brother, and watching cartoons. Markie had a passion for building Lego structures and would spend hours creating intricate designs. His love for adventure extended to the outdoors, where he enjoyed fishing trips with his dad and exploring local parks. Another thing Markie liked to do was cook with his mother. The two would spend weekend afternoons baking cookies and preparing meals. Markie was also a huge fan of superheroes, often imagining himself as a crusader saving the day, much like his favorite character, Spider-Man. More than likely, his love for such fictional heroes is what fueled Markie's dream of one day becoming involved in law enforcement. Before the age of 8, Markie was already telling several adults about wanting to become a SWAT team member one day. On picture day at school, Markie's rosy cheeks shined beneath the frames of his oversized glasses, adding only to his undeniable charm and studious demeanor. But Markie didn't just look smart, he was extremely intelligent. As soon as he entered elementary school, he thrived academically. Excelling in subjects such as math and art, Markie quickly began to showcase both a growing analytical mind with a creative spirit. Along with an eagerness to learn, Markie was a social butterfly. He had no problem making friends. His teachers described him as a bright student who always looked out for others. Whether it was sharing his snacks at lunch or comforting a classmate who felt left out, Markie carried a sense of understanding that was very unique for a boy of only 8 years old. At recess, he was the first to organize games, ensuring that everyone had a chance to participate. He also had a knack for resolving conflict on the playground. If there was an argument over a ball or a debate regarding whose turn it was on the swings, it was often Markie who would step in and do his best to resolve the issue. From the very start, it was clear that Markie was a unique boy that had a very bright future ahead of him.
With that said, the boy's home life slowly degraded and eventually became the complete contrast to the radiance he exuded at school. The first real sign of conflict in Markie's life came when his mother started dating 43-year-old Keith Lamont Burley Jr., who also happened to be incarcerated. Platforms like WriteAPrisoner.com have become an odd yet common phenomenon in recent years. These websites allow prisoners to create profiles where they share details about themselves, including their interests, life stories, and reasons for seeking correspondence. Visitors outside of prison walls can easily browse these profiles and choose which inmates they connect with, whether it be by letters, emails, or even phone calls. For some, writing to prisoners can be a mere act of kindness or a way to provide moral support. For others, a more intimate curiosity is attached, a motivation known to result in romantic or even long-term relationships. Allegedly, this is how Maram and Keith met.
In 1999, when Keith was 23 years old, he received a 20 to 40-year prison sentence after shooting a Newcastle man in the back of the head. As a result, Keith was convicted of burglary and third-degree murder. And yes, we did source this. This is true. As some of you might be thinking, hey, usually when you're charged with murder and another crime, don't they push for life or the death penalty? Well, apparently in Keith's case, he got lucky. While incarcerated, he was also charged as a result of two separate incidents where he allegedly assaulted various inmates. It was while Keith was behind bars that Maram came across his inmate profile and decided to send him a message. From there, Maram and Keith began exchanging letters. Over the next several months, their correspondence deepened, ultimately creating a questionable bond that led to plans of sharing a life together once Keith was released. And somehow, Keith only served his minimum 20 years. Keith was released on parole in March of 2019, at which time he and Maram transitioned from pen pals to romantic partners in real life. It wasn't long after this when Maram introduced her new felon boyfriend to her two sons, something that their biological father vehemently contested. Despite her ex-husband's views, Keith quickly inserted himself into the children's lives. Now, in the beginning, things seemed to be going okay. Keith initially presented himself as a genuine human being who had turned his life around. The boys, ever so vulnerable, immediately took a liking to Keith and referred to him by his nickname, Bud. Despite the opportunities for rehabilitation in prison, Keith's pattern of behavior proved to be unchanged. He quickly became volatile, exhibiting the same tendencies that had long defined him many years ago. Friends and acquaintances described Keith as unpredictable, manipulative, and prone to violent outbursts. Acquaintances of Keith also recounted several instances where his anger became so intense that they feared for their own personal safety. And the relationship between Keith and Maram was no different here. Frequent arguments and even physical altercations eventually became common occurrences. Keith's perpetual hostility quickly devolved the once positive family dynamic between Maram and the boys, ultimately spawning an environment that could only lead to devastating consequences.
On the evening of July 8th, 2019, Maram picked Keith up at a family member's house while her two sons innocently sat next to each other in the back seat. Keith had planned to stay the night with Maram and the boys, as he often did, but those plans quickly changed when the tension between the couple reached a breaking point. After picking up Keith, the boys eventually fell asleep in the back seat of the family Buick. A short time later, Maram pulled into a nearby gas station to purchase fuel. While there, she asked Keith if he wouldn't mind pumping her gas. Keith instantly snapped back and refused, ordering Maram to do it herself. In turn, a heated argument broke out. Somehow, the verbal altercation eventually shifted toward Maram's cell phone that was missing. After deciding she had enough, Maram informed Keith she was taking him back to where he came from. Naturally, this only angered Keith even further, prompting him to grab Maram by the throat with his left hand and start punching her in the face with the other. During the assault, a ring on Keith's finger split Maram's left eye. Her cries caused the boys to wake up, only to find their mother gasping for air as Keith continued to choke her from the front seat. As the boys begged him to stop, Keith took it one step further, leaning in and viciously taking a bite out of Maram's cheek. With both blood and tears streaming down her face, Maram threw the Buick in drive and proceeded toward the Newcastle Fire Department to seek refuge. As Markie and his brother continued to wail from the back seat, the group of four arrived at that fire station minutes later, at which time Maram began desperately leaning on the horn. Before help could arrive, Keith exited the passenger seat, walked around to the front of the car, and ripped Maram out from behind the wheel. After overpowering his girlfriend and throwing her to the ground, Keith angrily seethed the following four words that would haunt Maram for the rest of her life. "I'm kidnapping the children."
Keith then hopped in the driver's seat, slammed the door behind him, and peeled out in the Buick, leaving Maram battered and bruised on the concrete. As she struggled to get to her feet, the last thing Maram saw was her sons' faces, terrified with their tiny hands pressed against the car window, right before the Buick disappeared into the night. Immediately, Maram rushed towards the open bay of the fire station's garage. Meanwhile, the two boys were unknowingly en route to Keith's friend's home in nearby Union Township. After pulling down the dark driveway, Keith ordered Markie and his brother out of the car and aggressively shoved the boys indoors. Neither Markie nor his brother had ever been to this home before, so they had no idea where they were. Immediately, Keith began throwing objects inside the home while screaming at the boys. He then grabbed each of their throats, one in each hand, and began choking them. When Keith finally released his grip, the boys started to cry. Moments later, Keith left the children and proceeded toward a bedroom on the first floor. Seconds later, he returned. The boys could see that he was holding a gun. Keith pointed it at one of the boys' heads, and just as he was about to pull the trigger, he realized the magazine was missing from the firearm. While Keith frustratingly scoured the residence in search of the missing magazine, two older boys curiously emerged from an upstairs bedroom. Keith then ordered the two older boys to help him look for the magazine. At one point, all four boys found themselves inside the upstairs bedroom together as the teens searched for it. Seconds later, Keith stormed into the room, grabbed Markie by the arm, and dragged him downstairs. His brother followed close behind while the two teens remained upstairs, where they proceeded to play video games as if nothing out of the ordinary was going on.
While downstairs, the younger boy noticed that Keith was no longer holding the gun. Instead, he had a knife clenched in his right hand. Before either of the young boys could process what was going on, Keith rushed 8-year-old Markie and started to stab him. In a fit of blind rage, Keith plunged the blade into Markie's small body relentlessly. His brother screamed at the top of his lungs and ordered Keith to stop, but was too fixated to hear him. While Markie was helplessly pinned down by the weight of Keith's knees, the grown man continued to stab him. The younger boy then ran into the kitchen where he grabbed a chair and attempted to strike Keith over the head. Despite his courageous efforts to save his brother, the 7-year-old was no match for the grown man who continued to stab Markie a total of 146 times. With each downward thrust of the knife, he could hear Keith yell the words, "Die, die, die," repeatedly, and stood witness to his older brother's murder.
Seconds later, the younger boy made a run for it. He managed to escape from the house by sprinting out of the driveway, down a hill, and towards a fast food restaurant just a few blocks away. While waving his arms in the drive-thru line, customers waiting for their food quickly exited the vehicle and rushed to the little boy's aid. Through tears, he told the strangers what happened to Markie down the street, at which point the police were notified. When authorities arrived at the residence, they entered to find Markie's lifeless body in a pool of blood in the living room. Investigators were shocked at the sheer brutality of the scene, as well as the blood splattered on the floor and the walls. As for Keith Burley, he was nowhere to be found and apparently fled shortly after realizing that Markie's brother had escaped. Authorities worked quickly to track down the suspect, resulting in a multi-state manhunt. After following various leads, investigators were eventually brought to Youngstown, Ohio, roughly 19 miles away from the scene of the crime. 9 hours after Markie was killed, Keith Burley was spotted along Market Street in the downtown. U.S. Marshals quickly formed a perimeter with guns drawn. Keith was surrounded within seconds, and surely realizing that there was no escape for him, Keith surrendered and was apprehended without further incident. Shortly after his arrest, Keith was extradited back to Pennsylvania to face charges including simple assault, terrorism, kidnapping, and criminal homicide. Ahead of trial, Keith Burley chose to represent himself, a decision that drew significant attention from both the public as well as legal experts.
During preliminary hearings, Keith's behavior was erratic, often marked by bizarre attempts to deflect blame from himself. Now, at one point, the killer sought to have the entire jury panel replaced, arguing that none of the jurors were black and that due to a perceived racial bias, it would be impossible for him to receive a fair trial. This motion was denied. Due to the sensitive nature of the case, one juror was excused, which only caused further delays. Nearly 4 years after Markie was killed, Keith Burley's murder trial finally began in August of 2023. During opening statements, the defendant accused prosecutors of planting a piece of clothing among his belongings at the time of his arrest. The state countered with video evidence presented in court, indicating that Keith was wearing the clothing in question at the time he was apprehended. Keith also felt the need to imply that he had been unjustly transferred between various jails and state prisons during his incarceration, resulting in prolonged confinement under artificial lighting, which he claimed had caused damage to his eyesight. How this was relevant to the murder of an 8-year-old child remains unclear. The prosecution's case was presented much more eloquently, detailing Keith's criminal past and propensity for violence that senselessly resulted in the murder of Markie Mason. The state presented the theory that Keith Burley took his frustrations surrounding his romantic relationship out on someone he knew would hurt his girlfriend the most, suggesting that Markie's murder was committed solely out of malice and hatred towards the victim's mother.
During the trial, the court heard testimony from several members of Markie's family, including his younger brother who was there. The now 11-year-old boy bravely took the stand where he recalled what he witnessed that night in 2019. The prosecutor asked him what exactly happened to Markie. His brother simply stated, "He got killed. He jumped on Markie and was stabbing him. I watched and I hit him with a chair." When Markie's father took the stand, Mark Sr., he expressed a feeling of emptiness that he could not adequately convey into words. At one point, emotions were running high when Markie's father exchanged profanities with Keith in the courtroom, leading deputies to intervene and physically separate the two men. When Markie's mother took the stand, she struggled to relive the traumatic events of July 8th, 2019. Not once during the proceedings did Maram make eye contact with her ex-boyfriend, even when she was forced to endure cross-examination delivered by the same man who took her son's life. While she was on the stand, Keith proceeded to ask Maram several peculiar questions, including an irrelevant inquiry about when their relationship officially came to an end. To this, Markie's mother responded by stating, and I quote, "When you killed my son." The defendant never showed any sign of remorse throughout the 8-week trial. In the end, it only took the jury 15 minutes to reach their verdict. In August of 2023, Keith Burley, a former convicted felon, was found guilty of both second and first-degree murder. This 47-year-old child killer was subsequently sentenced to 2 life terms in prison that would run concurrently and without the possibility of parole.
Markie's death sent shockwaves through Newcastle, and eventually, the nation as a whole. While Markie's mother Maram is certainly one of the countless victims of Keith Burley's violence, one can't help but wonder, how or why did she knowingly welcome a convicted killer into her home and around her children? While the answer to that question remains unknown, public vigils were soon held in Markie's honor. Hundreds of people in and around Newcastle gathered to pay their respects. Markie's classmates created memorials at his school, as well as placing flowers, notes, and artwork on his desk.
Just months after Markie's death, Pennsylvania lawmakers introduced Markie's Law, a proposal aimed at delaying parole considerations for inmates convicted of violent offenses while incarcerated. The proposal passed through the Pennsylvania Senate, and it reflected widespread support from local lawmakers who believed in prioritizing public safety. However, despite bipartisan backing of this bill, it faced opposition from Pennsylvania Governor Tom Wolf. And on November 1st, 2022, Governor Wolf vetoed Markie's Law, citing concerns that the legislation would unnecessarily extend incarceration for inmates and potentially exacerbate issues of systemic inequity within the criminal justice system. Supporters of the bill, including Pennsylvania State Representative Aaron Bernstein, expressed deep disappointment in the veto and even outrage. In a press release submitted by the Pennsylvania Republican House, Representative Bernstein was quoted stating the following: "Had this animal who murdered Markie Mason remained behind bars, he would still be alive today. How does this bill not promote public safety? The legislation is all about keeping criminals locked up so they can't be harmful to society." Representative Bernstein emphasized that the law was crafted not to punish inmates arbitrarily, but to safeguard communities by ensuring violent offenders remained behind bars. Despite the veto, Markie's Law remains a focal point in discussions surrounding criminal justice reform in Pennsylvania. It underscores the need for a balance between rehabilitation and public safety, as well as the ongoing effort to honor the memory of child victims just like Markie Mason.
Markie's funeral was held on July 15, 2019, at St. Elias Orthodox Church in Newcastle, Pennsylvania. Family, friends, and community members gathered to celebrate his life and to say goodbye. His small white casket was adorned with flowers, and photos of him smiling served as a poignant reminder of the joy he brought to those around him. Today, Markie's memory lives on in the hearts of those who knew him. His story serves as a powerful reminder of the need for vigilance in protecting vulnerable individuals and addressing the systemic issues that allow violence to persist. Markie's name has become a symbol of hope and a call for change, ensuring that his legacy endures.